Hi friends, welcome back to Quiet Time. Let's read Chapter 12. Chapter 12 on page 134, The Domino Decision. I was hoping to get back to school the next day, but Mrs. Brisbane said she wanted to present the doctor's report to Principal Morales and Mrs. Payne and the room mothers so that everyone would agree that it was all right for me to go back to the classroom. This was disappointing, of course. For one thing, my friends were putting the finishing touches on Humphreyville. For another thing, Og got to go back to room 26 since nobody accused him of making humans sick, and I was all alone at the Brisbane house. The Brisbanes were nice, but my job was to help my classmates, and it was pretty hard to do that without being there. Did Miranda have a job she liked? Was Art paying attention in class? Did Paul look happier now? I had no way of knowing sitting in my cage at the Brisbane's house. Mr. Brisbane tried to entertain me during the day, but it seemed quiet compared to room 26. For one thing, he was out in his workshop a lot, making things out of wood. Or he was at the senior center, where he taught other people to make things out of wood. Some evenings he went out and taught wood crafting at the youth center while Mrs. Brisbane graded papers. I had plenty of time to think. Mostly, I thought about Miranda. And I thought about what a rat I was. I've noticed that humans sometimes called bad people rats. I'd like to tell them that the pet rats they sold at Petorama were perfectly decent and upstanding rodents. I knew I was a rat because I'd let Miranda take the blame for something that I had done. And I hadn't helped her because I wanted to keep my freedom so I could come and go as I pleased. No wonder I'd had trouble eating and sleeping. However, the vitamin chews were just as yummy as Dr. Drew had said. When Mrs. Brisbane came home, she was full of news about room 26. She told her husband and me that Mandy, Art, and Heidi were all back in school, but that Richie and Saya were out sick. Obviously, there was something going around, and that something was not me, thank goodness. She also told us that instead of having their homes sitting around on tables, the student had actually put Humphrey together like a real town. I think I'd like to move there myself, she told me, and your statue looks great. You must be proud, Humphrey, said Mrs. Brisbane. Not many hamsters have statues built in their honor. He didn't realize that it was the statue of a rat. Mrs. Brisbane said that Principal Morales had given permission for me to come back in the classroom. All the parents had been contacted and everyone wanted me back. Of course, she said the kids always did want me back. Here's the best news of all. Mandy's mother called and said that she'd read Dr. Drew's report and that she was so sorry she blamed you for making her kids sick. She said that they probably just had bad colds. Then she told me something else. Mrs. Brisbane paused. What? Mr. Brisbane asked. What? I squeaked. She said that in the end, it was a good thing Humphrey went to the vet because her husband ended up getting a job at the veterinary clinic. I guess he'd been out of work for quite a while. She told me to thank him. She turned to me and said, "Thank you, Humphrey." I was happy. I was ecstatic, which was a long word that means really, really, really happy. Ordinarily, I would have jumped on my wheel and spun for joy, but for some reason, the more good news Mrs. Brisbane had, the worse I felt. All the nice feelings just made me feel more and more like a rat. It's not easy being a rat. It's easier to make a decision. And even a rat like me can make the right decision. Of course, I'd always known what the right thing was to do. Deciding to do it was another thing. Later that evening, after their dinner, the Brisbanes sat near my cage and played a game of dominoes. It seemed like an interesting game with lots of dots on rectangular tiles. They moved the dominoes around, making long rows that crisscrossed the table. Occasionally, one of them would shout, "Good one," or "Oh no." I took a deep breath. Then, as I had done so many times before, I reached out, jiggled my lock that doesn't lock, and opened the door to my cage. But Mrs. Brisbane's gonna find out that his lock doesn't lock. I darted out onto the table and danced across the dominoes, figuring I might as well enjoy my last bit of freedom. Mrs. Brisbane gasped, "Oh, Humphrey!" Just then, I lost my footing on the slick tiles and skidded across a row of dominoes, sending them scattering in different directions. "Hey, I was winning," said Mr. Brisbane. He scooped me up in his hand and stroked my fur. "Calm down, calm down." "How on earth did he get out?" Mrs. Brisbane leaned over to inspect my cage door. "I guess I didn't close it all the way." "I guess not." Mr. Brisbane gently put me back inside my cage and closed the door. He tested it from the outside. "Now it's closed tightly. Want to try another game?" "Sure." Mrs. Brisbane turned all the dominoes facing down so I couldn't see any of the dots. She mixed them up, and she and her husband each drew 7 tiles. When they called bones, Mr. Brisbane drew 1 tile and put it in the corner of the table, and the game began. I stopped to catch my breath. Mrs. Brisbane was convinced she hadn't closed the door properly. I still had a chance to keep my freedom and keep being a rat. But I'd made up my mind. There was no turning back. I waited until there were rows of dominoes going in all directions. Picturing Miranda's face, I pushed my lock that doesn't lock, and the door to my cage swung open. I scurried across the table, leaped onto the dominoes, and squeaked, "Don't you get it? Miranda didn't leave my cage door unlocked." I knew it sounded like squeak, squeak, squeak to the humans, but I had to get my point across. The Brisbanes looked more surprised. They looked stunned. "How did he do that?" Mr. Brisbane asked after a few seconds of silence. "I know that door was locked." Mrs. Brisbane picked me up. "Humphrey, what are you trying to tell us?" Mr. Brisbane went over to my cage and fiddled around with the door again. "I don't get it. I just don't get it," he muttered. He closed the door and joggled it. "It sure seems like it's tightly locked. Hey, I have an idea." He grabbed a pencil from the table and pushed it through the bars of my cage, pushing it against the inside of the lock. This was one smart man. He pushed it and nothing happened until he twisted it from the inside the way I do. Of course, the door swung right open. "That's it. It looks as if it's locked on the outside, but Humphrey can open it. I wonder how many times he's done that." If only they knew. "I always knew Humphrey was smart," said Mrs. Brisbane. Mr. Brisbane kept fiddling around with the lock. "It's clearly defective. I guess we'll have to get a new cage. Or a new hamster," said his wife. "Just kidding, Humphrey." She put me back in the cage and Mr. Brisbane closed the door. He wheeled out of the room for a minute and came back with a piece of wire. "I'll keep it closed for now. The wire will work, but it might be hard for your students to use, and who knows if Humphrey can undo this too. I hoped I could." Mrs. Brisbane suddenly stood up with a look of horror on her face. "Miranda," she said with a gasp. "I punished her for not locking the cage, and she was sure that she did." "She probably did," Mr. Brisbane agreed. "Oh, I feel terrible, Bert. She even cried." So Mrs. Brisbane felt bad about Miranda just as I did. "Well, nothing's done that can't be undone," Mr. Brisbane said. He was wrong. There was something done that could never be undone. My freedom and the chance to get out to help my friends were over. Mrs. Brisbane decided to keep me home another day so her husband could get me a new cage. I was sad, sad, sad to see my cage all wired up, but I went into my sleeping hut and slept soundly most of the day because I had a clean conscience for the first time in a long time. I was no longer a rat. A conscience is that little voice in your head that's saying, "Oh, I feel really bad for what I did. I made someone feel really sad or got someone in trouble," and it doesn't really make you feel good inside about what you did. The new cage looked a lot like the old one, especially after Mr. Brisbane transferred all of my belongings. My seesaw, my tree branch, my climbing ladder, my bridge ladder, my wheel, of course, my water bottle, and my mirror, even the cage extension. I held my breath when he took the mirror out of my old cage. After all, I keep a secret notebook and pencil that Miss Mack gave me, hiding behind it. Luckily, I had planned ahead. The previous night, while the Brisbanes were sleeping, I spent a long time pushing the notebook and pencil against the back of my mirror. It fit perfectly into the little notch behind it. When Mr. Brisbane pulled the mirror out, he didn't even notice the notebook and pencil. He hung the mirror on the side of my new cage. Whew, might have lost my freedom, but at least I had my notebook and pencil to keep me busy. Unfortunately, it was Friday, which meant that there was no school the next day and nowhere to spend the weekend except with the Brisbanes. It was a nice weekend, mostly quiet, except when Bert Brisbane took me out of my cage and set up an amazing maze for me to run. The exercise felt good, and I ate some more afterward. I guess I was feeling healthy after all. On Monday morning, Mrs. Brisbane covered my cage with a blanket and took me back to school. Room 26 was strange and yet familiar. For one thing, I'd been away for almost a whole week. For another, the houses of Humphreyville had been arranged on tables along the side of the room, so it really looked like a town. Everybody seemed glad to have me back. "Hiya, Humphrey Dumpty," said AJ. "I missed you, Humphrey," Saya said softly. "It was lonely here without you," Miranda told me. "It was hard to sit still without you here," Seth whispered, "but I did a pretty good job." "Boing, boing," Og greeted me. Even the crickets chirped. The bell rang and my friends settled down in their chairs. "Boys and girls, before we do anything else today, I have something important to say." The room was very quiet after those words. Something important could mean a pop quiz, a special guest, or someone getting into trouble. I am a teacher, but I'm also a human being, and all human beings make mistakes. I want to tell you about a mistake that I made. There was one small giggle, probably from Gail, then the room became even quieter. A few weeks ago, I accused Miranda of leaving Humphrey's cage open because I felt that Humphrey could have been seriously injured. I had to lower her grade. That was my mistake. I glanced over at Miranda, and so did a number of my friends. She stared at Mrs. Brisbane, her eyes wide with surprise. It turns out there was something wrong with the lock on Humphrey's cage. It appeared to be locked, but he was able to open it from the inside. He did the same thing to me that he did to Miranda. Now all eyes were not on Miranda. They were on me. This is the last page of chapter 12. Humphrey has a cage now with a lock that works. Miranda, I'm restoring your good grade. All eyes turned back on Miranda. She was smiling. Most important, class, I want to publicly apologize to Miranda for wrongly accusing her and not believing what she said was true. She is an honest person, and I hope she will accept my apology. Will you, Miranda? Of course, Mrs. Brisbane. I was never sure. I am sure, said the teacher. Now please take out a piece of paper for your spelling test. Guys, it is so important that when you make a mistake, and especially if it hurts someone else, that you always tell them that you made the mistake and that you apologize and you'll try better next time. Spelling test? I'd been gone all week. I didn't even know what the words were. I went into my sleeping hut for a nap and slept quite comfortably, knowing how happy Miranda was and how happy the whole class was for her. Miranda, being golden Miranda and practically perfect, came over to my cage at the end of the day. "I'm sorry that you're stuck in your cage, Humphrey. I bet you liked your freedom. Now that's why I had to do what I did. Yes, yes, yes," I squeaked. "I love you, Humphrey. Even being locked up in a cage didn't seem so bad after all." Humphreyville rejoices as Hamster returns to room 26. Mrs. Brisbane apologizes to Golden Miranda. The Humphreyville Herald. All right, friends, have a great rest. We will read chapter 13 tomorrow. Good night.